Back, everybody, to People Talking from a Social Distance. Once again, we have a wonderful guest this week. This person's a relative newcomer to Sycamore 427, but he already feels like an institution in a lot of ways. A true student of world culture. You just don't ask him about history. It's our friendly neighborhood aspiring polyglot, Mitch Doty.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you here. You were one of the first people who just reached out after watching one of the podcasts to say, hey, I'd love to help. I'd love to support. So I appreciate you being here. And when we started to talk about what we could talk about, I just got more and more excited. Obviously, as an English person or an English teacher, I love anytime anyone wants to talk about language. But the whole approach you started talking to me about and the whole idea that you wanted to bring forth is really exciting to me. And so I guess we start by just talking a little bit about quarantine, and you made an interesting decision over quarantine in regards to language. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so being a Spanish teacher, obviously my passion for learning a new language after my own native language is probably pretty obvious. But I was sitting in quarantine, and I'm a person that I do really well with structure. I love being at school every day, interacting with people. So I was going a bit stir crazy, and I was like, hey, you know what? I need to take on some sort of an activity to just like stimulate my mind a little bit, kind of like a hobby. But I like something that's active, just like learning a language or something, as opposed to just sitting watching a TV show. I was like, I need to do something. I have to get my brain involved in it. So I've always been interested in languages in general, and it's always been kind of cool to learn, dabble a little bit here and there and learn some phrases. But then I decided that, hey, it'd be kind of cool to take on the task of learning a third language after English and Spanish, because I thought that'd be kind of a cool way to thrive and grow as opposed to just kind of sit and not do anything during our time in quarantine.
Yeah, most of us took up baking. You decided to learn another language, which is awesome. You decided to learn Portuguese, and I wonder why, because I think the Portugal is fascinating, and the literature I've read from there is amazing. What drew you to that specific language?
Yeah, so my thought process was, honestly, I was thinking, well, what's a language that's pretty similar to Spanish? Because I wasn't going to be on my own. I wasn't going to be in a classroom with other people. So I actually made the decision because Spanish and Portuguese is one of the closest language pairs that exists. So I think there's like I forget the percentage, but it's around like 50-60% of verbs are like spelled the same or spelled almost the same. So I figured that'd be a good way to kind of have an edge on it already, have a little bit of a head start, which definitely happened. I've noticed there's a lot of similar things that happen in the languages. I didn't have to relearn too many difficult concepts. So a lot of it was based on what I thought I could start off with. I wouldn't be like starting something like Chinese where I would have to learn a whole entire system of writing or Russian. So I figured, hey, let's keep it to something that's similar to what I know, just to give me a little bit of a head start.
Right on. Yeah. And I think, and now you can just sort of move across Europe, right? Get all the romantic languages eventually. I think a lot of people, they hear this and they probably hear like, get the head start. You already have a passion for it. And we started talking yesterday about the misconceptions around learning a new language. And I think you spoke really awesomely to that concept. Because I came at you with the whole Chomsky, right, like degenerative grammar, and I think you have a really great response to that, and I think that's something that could really be shared with everyone.
Yeah, so I mean, I know a lot of people come to the idea of learning a new language as a very daunting task. I hear it all the time, people who talk to me like, man, that's so cool, like I just can't do that, that's just so much, I don't have the time. And though it is definitely something that requires a commitment and some time, and it definitely requires active work. It's not just something you can sit and, hope that you'll absorb it 100%. There's some benefits to just listening to a language, but you need to actively be working at it. And it does take working almost every day at it to kind of help that process move along. But I think a lot of people always are thinking about, oh man, like it's just, I'm older now, right? I'm not a kid. It just doesn't quite work for us. Like, kids learn better. And though there's a lot of truth in that, it's actually not for the reason that most people believe in. So actually, kids are very great at learning a new language because of this concept called the affective filter. It's this idea was created by a a language acquisition theorist named Stephen Krashen, and he came up with it. Essentially, your effective filter is what stops you from taking a chance at saying something. So, for example, you hear a kid talking in the past tense with some irregular verbs in English. You hear kids say, "Oh, I go to the park this weekend and I do this," or, and us as adult speakers might be like, "Oh, well, he's making some simple mistakes, but he's just a kid." But what happens is an adult isn't as willing to take that chance to play with the language, try and make it their own, mess up, make an error, but then learn from it, whereas kids thrive at that. So in all reality, an adult is actually cognitively way better equipped. If you start learning a new set of vocab words or some new concept, you are more adept to learning it and remembering that quicker, whereas the kid doesn't have that strength, but the kid doesn't really care. They will just take a chance. And a lot of us as adults, and especially something I see as working with adolescents, they're scared to make a mistake. People are scared to, oh man, like I'm not going to be correct. People are going to look at me funny. But that's just the process of learning. And so that's where that misconception comes in.
Yeah, and I think that's not only an awesome concept to talk about in language, but I think that's something that most people could bring to any situation or anything that they're learning, right? All of us are trying to learn new skills now that we have so much extra time in quarantine or in the lockdown. And I think that's really a cool concept to take to a bigger picture in terms of try things, make it your own. And that idea of creation is also really awesome.
Oh yeah, 100%, 100%. I know that like with even other courses, right, it takes that making an error, maybe sometimes working, trying to do something, and then having, especially here, having a teacher be able to explain or work you through it. It's better than just not doing anything at all.
Right. Yeah. I think what you're saying too with that dovetails nicely into all the things we're trying to do with the Wellness Committee and some of the different tenets that we have. And again, that was something that you approached me with, like, hey, this whole concept fits in nicely with this. So I know I have some thoughts on how it fits with wellness. What are your thoughts in terms of how this process fits with our?
Yeah. So I've noticed two major things in my life, at least. So one, like I was mentioning earlier, in quarantine, I was kind of needing some structure in my life. And I have found that as I've taken on like just 30 minutes a day, and that's pretty much all I spend on in Portuguese, that's helped me a ton, like just getting some sort of a schedule. Hey, like before I go to bed, I got to spend 30 minutes. I prefer to do stuff at night. I'm not really as much a morning person for learning stuff. I will do that sometimes, but I really like just learning a little bit of Portuguese, kind of gets my mind settled, and then I can go to sleep, right? It's nice to get a little bit of a pattern going. But then also I've noticed that kind of like that social aspect that we've heard a lot from with the Wellness Committee, just being able to interact with people and how that's been a really big theme throughout being quarantined, and the whole coronavirus situation has really made people feel a little more isolated. And I actually found that by learning Portuguese, I've actually kind of figured out some new ways to connect with people that I probably wouldn't have before, because I was doing some research and I ended up finding a website that helped me get connected with native speakers, and they're native Portuguese speakers from Brazil, and they're learning English. So essentially it connects you with some people, and it's like, hey, I can help you with English for 30 minutes and you can help me with Portuguese for 30 minutes. We'll talk for an hour on Skype. And that's something that I probably wouldn't have thought of before, right? Before the age of Zoom and using all these types of online platforms to communicate. So I actually ended up getting some new and interesting interactions, and actually with people of a different culture, which, I mean, as we know, is always really interesting, getting to learn things that you could never have, even imagined, and talking about food and what they like to do in their free time, and actually talking about how the quarantine was going for them and what they were doing to pass the time. So it actually was a really great way to connect with others, surprisingly.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think even as you're describing that, it makes me think also, especially saying that you like to learn it at night, and that helps sort of settle your mind, fitting in with that downshift as well, and sort of taking something that obviously is what you do professionally, but also something you obviously love, and getting a chance to let that flourish and do even more. I think that's awesome, that idea of being able to trade lessons in your language for lessons in someone else's. And I think it really speaks to just how teachers are, right?
Yeah.
How they act. It's just great. You brought up learning about cultures, and I really like this concept. And we talked again yesterday, and I was just like, yeah, let's dive into this. But this idea of like learning culture through context, and like even learning language through context, I think you spoke a lot about how it's a better way forward, and I just think again we can apply that outside of just learning a language. So, what are your thoughts on learning things through context as opposed to system?
Oh yeah, I mean, involving culture into that and context, like learning about someone else's culture is hard to do without learning their language, and learning their language is difficult to learn without learning their culture. So it's a very interconnected thing, you know. And so when I've gotten to talk to these people, they approach life from a different way. They think about things differently. So and learning through, like we said, context is integral. That's like the biggest theme. I could, go on forever. And there's, YouTubers, sorry, and people who have hours of content related to just that idea of learning through context and using a reading, using a video, using someone talking to you, and taking all that information and putting it together, as opposed to, here, I'm going to drill these 10 words, I'm going to just use flashcards, but you're not using it within their context, within their culture. So there's things you can't quite learn. Like, I remember one of my favorite conversations with one of my friends that I met that lives in Brazil through this website. We were talking, and she brought up food, and there's, food terms that are specific to Brazil. I mean, obviously, if you go to a Brazilian restaurant, you might be able to learn of those, but I learned about a couple of dishes. I was like, dang, like that sounds really good. And then I could look up a recipe, and then that leads to, some other things. If you're interested in cooking, you can, do that a little bit. It's a whole nother lifestyle as opposed to a course of material.
Yeah, I agree, and I love that idea. I know the ways I usually approach a culture are through their literature and their cooking, and that's something I know I've had with my family, where it's like, you guys missed the boat, and we don't even have anyone who still speaks Polish, but like we still got pierogi and stuff. Like we've got the recipes. We're keeping it going.
Yeah, it's so ingrained. It's so ingrained into every aspect of one's lifestyle, language, and what they do. They're so interconnected that it's really interesting.
I agree. I think this idea of culture and context is also something, obviously, when it comes to literature, that I think a lot of. And you spoke about like getting to know something from that completely different lens. Have you found that to be the case, having learned multiple languages? Like that it changes your lens in any way of the way you view things?
Yeah. Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, like we kind of talked about, for example, if you watch a TV show, you see subtitles. The subtitles are written in American English, how we would break down a situation. But if you go word for word, it would look totally differently. So things aren't 100% translated. Translation helps a ton with bridging a gap between two languages. But the concept of things being different perspectives is huge. I mean, one, like I said, just the exact language. One of the biggest examples I use in Spanish class for my students is in English. If we're talking about how old we are, I would say, I'm 24 years old. We use the verb to be, I am. Whereas in Spanish, they conceptualize that idea differently. They say, I have 24 years. So they approach it as less of a I am. It's not, me, it's something that I've attained, I've acquired. So it definitely, and that's a very simple situation where it's, pretty easy to see how those are easily interchangeable between languages. But there's other concepts that are treated the same, where it's the way that they approach it, the way they think about it is totally different from maybe how we process things in English. And the difference between English and Spanish and German could be, 3 separate things, and then you add in Russian. So it's a different perspective of life. And as you acquire another language, it's really interesting, and you can really feel the world grow as far as perspectives and who is out there.
And that's something that I think most of us could use, especially as the world seems to shrink in 20.
Yeah, for sure.
That's awesome. And that whole idea of I have acquired a certain number of years versus I am, I think it's a subtle difference in nuance, but philosophically, it's huge. It's worlds apart. So that's really awesome. And again, not something I even thought about before this conversation in terms of like, whoa, but that definitely gives me more to think about. What's your end goal? How many languages are you going for eventually?
Okay, so obviously my short-term goal is to get Portuguese down. I would say I'm probably at an intermediate level. I can definitely talk. If you drop me on the streets of Rio de Janeiro, I'd probably be safe. I could find shelter, find food, do what I have to. A lot of that's because I borrowed it from Spanish, right? So my process went a little bit quicker than it would be for someone who's learning their second language. But long-term, my goal is to have 4. So that's when you're considered a polyglot or multilingual with 4 languages. So, and also my grandfather was a polyglot. He spoke 4 languages, and he was always a big inspiration, even in Spanish class in high school when I was here at this school, sitting in these rooms right here, learning Spanish, my second language. It was always so interesting, the stories that he would tell me. He grew up speaking Swedish in his house because his parents were from Sweden. And then he learned English to go to school here. Then he was in World War II. He was a bomber pilot in the war. And then he learned German after the war because he became a counterintelligence officer. So that was crazy. And then later in his life, he learned Spanish because he went on a mission trip to Chile, and he was very frustrated that he couldn't communicate with the families and the people that he was helping through that church that they were at. So he came back, and in 2 years got to a pretty decent level of Spanish, and then went back so he could build on that connection that he had made. And so it was always so interesting, and I would sit forever just listening to these stories. Oh, this one time in Germany, this one time in Chile, this one time speaking with my parents, and it just was so incredible to me, the amount of friends and relationships that he created through learning languages. So that was my inspiration. And so my goal is to match him. And I mean, if I can achieve that, I probably won't stop, to be honest.
That's awesome. Well, it's nice to know you come about it honestly, right? Like it's Well, I just want to thank you again for not only reaching out to be part of this, but for your support of what we're doing here. I was glad to be able to speak to you from a social distance, and I thank you for your time.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed being able to share a little bit of my life.